Welcome to you all. I am Reverend Kerri Parker with the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and it is my joy to introduce to you my co-moderator today, the Reverend Dr. Leah Schade. She is an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She is a member of the faculty at Lexington Theological Seminary, and she is a co-founder of the Clergy Emergency League. She has come to the attention of many people through this work. She has earned a lot of renown here in Wisconsin for her work on preaching in the purple zone. Lots of folks came to know her that way, and she's recently been awarded a grant for her work in that area as well. She's also done work on climate activism and anti-fracking. I hear rumors that she's a musician. And she somehow in the middle of it all also has a blog. So I don't know how you do the many things you do, like many women, but I am grateful for the places you put your attention, most definitely this one.
Thank you so much. And I want to introduce our other co-moderator, who you just heard from, the Reverend Kerri Parker. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and she's an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ. Reverend Parker has a long history of ecumenical work, and she is published in the anthology, There's a Woman in the Pulpit. And Reverend Parker, how long have you been with Wisconsin Council of Churches?
Coming on 4 years now.
4 years. And one of the reasons that WCC has come to many pastors' attention is because the fantastic work that you all have done around providing guidance during a time of COVID. So the recommendations that you gave to clergy in your state have been shared around the country. And you all put on such great programming that has benefited the wider church. So thank you so much for that work.
We're really grateful. It has been a help to so many people, and we've made lots of new friends that way, had some wonderful conversations, and been able to pray and have some heart-to-hearts together. So thank you for that. I wonder if we might invite one of your colleagues to open us in prayer today.
Absolutely.
Robert Brennick is here. He is on the steering committee of the Clergy Emergency League. Robert, would you unmute yourself and lead us?
Yes, we pray together. Holy God, your word calls life into being and stills the storms on the chaotic sea. Guide us and give us courage to speak your word of truth in this era of conspiracies and disinformation. Empower us for this work through the teaching and wisdom of Rachel, Heather, and Deborah as they share their stories and insights with us tonight. With gratitude for them and their presence with us for this time of learning together, strengthen us in our call to be messengers of truth and agents of reconciliation. Amid the chaotic chatter of conspiracies, keep us grounded in your word and the practices shared tonight to support and strengthen our faith communities in this ever-changing time. Make this time together a beacon of hope and communal encouragement for the ministry of truth-telling amid the storms of disinformation. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. What we're going to do now is introduce our panelists, and then we're going to go right into our first set of questions. We're going to begin with Rachel Bernstein, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and her weekly podcast, Indoctrination, covers cults, manipulators, and how people can protect themselves from systems of control. She serves on the advisory boards of both the International Cultic Studies Association and the Open Minds Foundation. She's worked with victims of cults and emotional abusers for 27 years. Her podcast gives survivors a chance to tell their stories and for experts to teach what they know so that listeners can learn how to protect themselves and their loved ones from predators, toxic personalities, and destructive organizations. Thanks for being with us, Rachel. And Kerri is going to introduce Reverend Heather Honeycutt.
Reverend Honeycutt is the pastor of Salem United Church of Christ in Pennsylvania, where she's also a licensed professional counselor and owns Evergreen Counseling and Consulting. Her areas of clinical expertise include cult recovery and religious and spiritual trauma, intellectual giftedness, and faith integration for persons in LGBTQ+ communities. She's currently a doctoral student, and her dissertation focuses on constructing a healthy post-traumatic spirituality, and it has both clinical and pastoral applications. So welcome, Heather. And Leah?
Our third panelist is Dr. Deborah Alexander, who is a former U.S. Department of State senior advisor and political officer. Her academic training is in political and social psychology. Her work in both the U.S. and in several countries overseas has been about reducing polarization and conflict, expanding civil and political space and rights. And she's worked everywhere from Kentucky to Afghanistan and everywhere in between. And we're grateful for your expertise. Thank you for being with us, Deborah.
Our first question for you all had to do with how you became interested in your work or your line of inquiry around cults, conspiracies, disinformation, and/or radicalization. Rachel, would you start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. And thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to answering people's questions towards the end. That's usually my favorite part, because then I get to know what people really want to know about, and I get to respond. So, by way of intro, I got interested in this because I had a sibling who got caught up in a cult when I was growing up, and it became kind of dinner table conversation about how that can happen. We were able to help her break free, but at the time there weren't resources, and this was before the internet, and the only way to get someone out was to kidnap them out, which we were not going to do. And I thought, well, once I decided to become a therapist, I realized I should probably be a resource, because we couldn't find one. And so it's been an interesting time. And my interest also now in talking to people who have been in relationships, sort of one-on-one cults, relationships with malignant narcissists is sort of part of my practice too. It came unfortunately from a personal experience. And then studying really cult leaders and controllers, and how the outcome of having been in a cult and also coming out of a relationship with a narcissist are almost identical. And so it's been an interesting ride, and I've felt very gratified now by things like this, that people really want to learn how to help people and respond in so many different fields. And it makes me feel that the people out there are going to be safer because of it.
Thank you. What about you, Heather?
So both the siege at Waco and Heaven's Gate took place when I was a young and a middle teenager, 1993 and 1997 respectively. And it just so happened that as a child, I lived down the street from a farm called Heaven's Gate, no relation. But if you remember back in the 90s, when the news cycle was so much longer than it is now, Heaven's Gate was in the news for weeks. The siege at Waco was on the news for months. And so part of my family just kind of atmosphere was watching the evening news. And as a curious kid, I was always very invested in what was going on in the world. And so in that space became very interested in what was spirituality, because even though I was raised in church, I wasn't raised in a church that said any of those things had to happen for, the eschaton to come, right? For the end of the world to be ushered in. I didn't think we had to go up in a fiery blaze or be taken up in the tails of a comet. So when I decided to become a therapist late in high school, it stuck with me that that was the work that I wanted to do. I was a weird kid. Anybody who is invested in this work is probably a little bit, tiny bit off center. I see my co-panelists nodding, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but
No, you got it.
Yeah. So just a little offbeat. And I designed an independent study around cults and cult recovery because I wasn't getting that training in grad school. And then because I wasn't getting it in grad school, I decided, well, why don't I go to seminary? And so I went to seminary and still didn't get the training I was looking for. And so it sort of came to theology by the back door, but that led me into a space where I could come to ordination and so could affect change, hopefully in both spheres, right, as both clergy and clinician. And so in 2015, I started teaching on radicalization when we started seeing the mostly young women from Europe go to the Middle East to join ISIS. And at that point, I knew that for me, there was no going back. Like this was going to be a big part of my life's work. And so essentially since then, I've been doing some kind of work in cult recovery, whether it's on a clinical scale or sort of a broader speaking scale.
And Deborah, what about you?
First of all, I want to thank everyone. I'm delighted to be a part of this group, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and the questions later. For me, I think I've always had an abiding interest in how we make distinctions between people. And as a child, I remember in church, a Sunday school teacher trying to tell me why Black people were Black. And I knew immediately as a child that her answers rang false. And then I remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president, and I heard family and church members and others make comments about his faith. And then when I was about 10, I happened to stumble into a KKK rally. And then also I was part of a community that I would notice women who had bruises and children who had the marks of being switched using a tree switch. And so all this sort of bubbled together in my interest about how is it that we discriminate? How do we have stereotypes? How do we make these distinctions? How are some of those distinctions laden with hate? How does that lead then into conflict and violence? And in graduate school, I focused on social and political psychology, on extremism, on political behavior, political groups. And my interest, then I worked for a number of years in expanding those sort of political and civil rights. But then I had the opportunity to join the State Department as a diplomat, and it was at the time of the Rwanda genocide. And so for me, genocide was part of that continuum of when we make these distinctions and when we hate on the basis of whether it's color or faith or sex or sexual orientation. And then I had a number of years working in, in Rwanda. How is it that 700,000 people are killed by their neighbors in Bosnia? How is it that 100,000 are killed? And then I came back to the States, similar kinds of interests, and how is it that we hate one another and how does that manifest itself? And then 9/11 happened. And so then I started focusing similar questions, but looking at terrorism. And now I find myself sort of bringing that lens back to not only foreign terrorism, but I'm looking at what has been coined domestic terrorism.
That's fascinating. Each of you obviously had that seed planted from an early age, and just being aware of what's going on in the world and making connections where maybe some of your peers did not. I think some of that off-centeredness that you were talking about, Heather, It makes us weird as kids, but boy, it helps us to be um, in our fields to be able to connect the dots. And I thank you for using those gifts in that way. So you all have sent us resources, and we're going to be sharing those in the chat in a little bit. And like 4.5 pages worth of really excellent resources. And one of the things I noticed was some stories about churches and conspiracy theories. And these are very recent, about how pastors are just flummoxed about the rise of QAnon and other sources of disinformation over the last 4 to 5 years. Heather, you had said that you didn't learn how to talk about this in seminary. None of us did. There were no electives on how to deal with cults that I can recall. This is not something that we were trained to deal with in our theological education. So just very briefly, give us just some basics for pastors who maybe are hearing about this for the first time or had been hearing about it in their congregation. They're just not quite sure what to do. Just help us understand a little bit about how this phenomenon has emerged and why people are drawn to this kind of conspiracy and disinformation. And Heather, let's start with you since you are a pastor.
Sure thing. Thanks so much. So I feel certain Rachel and Deborah will have perhaps more nuanced understandings. But speaking as clergy, something that I've noticed, Christian nationalism has been on the rise for some time, right? Christian nationalism essentially posits that Christianity and nationalism are one and the same, that patriotism is how you are a Christian in this country, right? That there's not a lot of differentiation between the flag and the cross, and that we bear both, kind of engaging in the manifest destiny that this country was founded on and called to, right? That's sort of the party line. So we have this, right, taking root decades ago. I would say really kind of started around World War I, grows during World War II, and continues into the present day in really significant ways. I think there's also a movement that one finds particularly within more evangelical circles, not to malign those circles, but I used to be in evangelical before I came to the mainline. And there is this thing in evangelical circles that says the pastor will preach and then they'll say, but don't believe me, search your Bibles, right? Which equates, in essence, theological education and training with what anyone can surmise from a basic reading of the text. Okay, so this is problematic, right? Because I didn't spend all this time and money on theological education, believing that what is plainly on the page is exactly what the Bible means. So there's that piece. I would also say we're on the fulcrum of a new way of being in this country. So we see massive inequalities coming to the fore, no longer covered over as they once were. And so we're having an equal and opposite reaction from those groups who would like to see things stay the same. Okay. And what's difficult about that is that there is this massive sense of anxiety and uncertainty. And anything like QAnon that promises certainty and that promises knowing the answer or what is going to come is attractive to folks who feel their footing is being removed from them. And I would also say that the pandemic has exploded just the impact of such ideas and the way that they're transmitted. And so to my mind, those are some of the major factors that have led to the spread of misinformation these last several years.
That's really fascinating. And Deborah, you and I have had some conversations, leading up to tonight, where the things that from what you told me, the things that we're seeing in this country are not new. You've seen this happen in other countries. What are some of the patterns that have happened in other countries that you're seeing here? What can you help us understand?
Well, I think it is true that there's a commonality across what some of the more extremist groups here in the US, whether that's the conspiracy fed groups or whether that's other groups, and other terrorist groups or violent extremists that we see it overseas as well. It's interesting to me, as someone who was overseas for so long, then to come back to my own country and to sort of see this emergence of QAnon and of a number of similar groups, really to see a reinvigoration of the white power movement. And so those groups are not new in the US, of course. QAnon is fairly new. It really got started about 2017, started attending the president's rallies about 2018. But certainly we have a history of similar groups in the United States. And as you mentioned, Leah, we have across the world. There's not a country that doesn't grapple with this question of radicalization, extremism. Not all extremists are violent, although that's a continuum. Terrorism, of course, is a violent use, political purposes behind it. QAnon and some Proud Boys and other groups that we've been hearing a lot about, and I think certainly in the last year or so, and certainly after January 6th, all of us suddenly became surprised and smarter maybe about hearing these names. And there is a commonality. I'm hesitant to say they're all the same because there are important differences in them. But it is true that whether it's Al-Qaeda, Taliban, QAnon, or the Proud Boys, there is this looking for some mission, some sense of purpose. There is possibly isolation and loneliness, and they're looking for information. That's where disinformation comes in, because they're very easily fall prey to poor sources of information. Particularly, they're looking for affiliation and to belong to something. And so those are some of the commonalities that I see. And it is more likely that we'll see a rise of extremism like QAnon. This has been a perfect storm in the last few years. As Heather said, we have had an expanded use of the internet happening. Then we had a pandemic where people, the only sometimes communication they had was through the internet and through social media. And then we have the sort of divisive discourse, public discourse, that for the first time in a long time really accelerated and amplified those polarizing voices and those messages, like in Charlottesville. And so that's sort of the similarities. Not to say that QAnon is the same as Al-Qaeda. There's certainly an important distinction to be made between extremist groups and terrorist groups. But those are some of the commonalities.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Deborah. Rachel, I think maybe we just want to pause and maybe just get some definition of terms here. Mm-hmm. What is QAnon? What is a cult? I mean, you've been studying this for 27 years. And, so for some pastors, this is the first time they're hearing some of these terms. What exactly is this? How did this get started? Who is QAnon?
Right, good question. And also because no one knows. But that adds to something that adds to the mystique of this. So to define a cult, the definition that I go with, just from studying so many groups like this, is that, first of all, there needs to be unquestioning devotion to the leader, to the teachings. And if you disagree at all, then you're pushed out, or you need to see there's something wrong with you, that your critical thinking is a threat to the organization. And so you're not allowed to have it. And the other part is that within a cultic system, I'm trying to get the sun out of my eyes, you have also this closed loop of information. Cults don't let you research cults. Actually, people within them know the least amount of accurate information about them because they're not allowed to access it. So they only know what they've been told. They only know the lies, basically. And that's what's so frustrating for the loved ones on the outside, where they say, don't you realize? And a person really honestly within a cult can say, no, I don't. It's not that. The other part is that within a cultic system, it becomes your entire life. You can't sort of have a day job or a family and whatever and still be involved in a cult. It not only becomes your life, but it becomes your ethical core as defined by the leader. Things that are illegal, or if the cult leader tells you to do them, it's for the greater good, it's for a better cause, and so it's all okay. There's also rampant deception. So you never know what you're involved in when you're involved in a cult. You never know really what their true intention is for you. Like if I were to as a Jewish woman, if I were to become Orthodox, I would know what's expected of me. I would know what I can eat and what I can't, and what I can wear and what I can't. Within a cult, you never know. You're always kept sort of in this mystery, where I think purposely it's so that you can get it wrong. And then the leader can admonish you and you can work harder to be in their good graces. I mean, there's so much manipulation. I think with, and there are many other things that define it, but I think what happens with a group like QAnon is that because we don't know who the leaders are, then it leaves a space for people to fill in the blanks in any way they want. So I think for a lot of people, then because we don't know who these people are, and we don't know if it's a bunch of teenagers in someone's basement, there is this sort of deification. You know, we can assume that they are all knowing. And I think also because a lot of the information is sent out in these kinds of hidden ways and with clues, people get drawn in to try to solve the equation and to try to figure out the riddle, almost like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they feel so good, like they were able to kind of understand the message. It also seems to make it more important and also more secret. People like being a part of something that's sort of secretive. But I think what QAnon also does for a lot of people is it gives them the sense that they're doing something important. They're actually not. There is nothing that has been able to be measurable and measured. No actual outcome. It hasn't saved any children, even though that seems to be why people get involved. But I think it makes people feel special and that they have the key, and they can feel superior. They can feel connected, you know, as Deborah was saying, during this time of isolation. And I also think that it gives people this sense that they can also unfortunately unleash their xenophobia, and they can unleash their anti-Semitism, and they can unleash all their phobias in what they think is an acceptable way, because it's sort of shrouded in this way that they're protecting people from the enemy. And so I think it's given people an excuse to sort of release, for some of them, to release their base instincts, and to know that they're not this lone voice anymore. And I think for a lot of people, it's given them a chance to have their anxiety and also paranoia kind of cared for. It speaks to anxiety, it speaks to paranoia, and it's an unfortunate thing because at the end of the day, it actually doesn't make them any calmer. It actually works people up into a froth. And what people don't know is that while they're trying to get the message across to us that there are all these people out there that we need to be afraid of, the truth is that the people who are in QAnon, because they're so on the offense and so aggressive, people are more afraid of them than they are the people they're telling us to be afraid of. So they're just not sort of understanding how they're coming across, and also that their good intentions of wanting to save the planet and save people are really being used for naught. And it's really quite a shame.
Wow, that's fascinating and horrifying. I want to just pause here and welcome those of you who may have just be joining us. This is Pastoring in the Age of Conspiracies and Disinformation. This is being co-sponsored by the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Clergy Emergency League. We're being co-moderated by Reverend Kerri Parker, and who is the executive director of Wisconsin Council of Churches, and myself, Reverend Dr. Leah Schade, co-founder of the Clergy Emergency League. I just want to do a quick screen share to show you that we have put together a list of resources and contacts that we will be sharing with all of you. We've got resources here about churches dealing with radicalized members, how you can understand what cults are, different kinds of cults, how to talk to people who are in cults, how to help people who are exiting out of cults, how to think about or how to distinguish fake news and disinformation, how to de-radicalize, how people can do that, examples of how that has been done, and support groups in creating resilient, respectful communities. These are all resources that have been put together by our panelists, which we will be sharing with all of you. So, Kerri, you've got a great question for the panel.
I do. It's actually rooted in our work on COVID and some of what we've been seeing and hearing from pastors. So many of them have faced struggles with their congregations, a lot of tension. Even some of them have been forced out or had to leave their churches because of impasses over the science around the coronavirus and ministry choices that they've made in their efforts to keep people safe. People who disbelieve the science about the virus, about the pandemic, pushing for in-building worship, balking at wearing masks and social distancing, things like that. We get a lot of questions about how to handle the tension in the congregation, especially now with Holy Week and Easter on the horizon, especially with the question of vaccines out there. I wonder, thinking about this misinformation, disinformation question, if you have any advice for these pastors.
I mean, I think, if I can jump in, and I want to hear what other people have to say too. I think that what you want to be able to do is to have a conversation with people to understand why they don't trust the science. What is making them feel like people are up to something, or that it's a means to control them or to hurt them in some way? Where does that information come from? I think when you help people, even from a young age, learn to analyze the source of their information, you help to keep them safer. And you don't want to come across like you're questioning it or doubting it, but you want them to be a smart, scientific, and spiritual consumer. And so that means that they need to, again, move out of that closed loop of information. We know before we read a study, we look to see who published it. And even before that, we look to see who sponsored it. And, then we'll know if we can listen to this information as it, it being forthright. I think that the issue is that people want to make sure that they are safe. And so I think you can respond to that, that they are feeling like they're being lied to, and how awful that is to not be able to trust the powers that be, and to come from a place of compassion, that it must be very hard to be in an environment that feels so divisive, where it's become so polarized, so black and white. And so I think one of the things that can be helpful is to help people find a place in the middle, to help them see that maybe sometimes it's a good idea, let's say, to wear a mask, and maybe not, show them the science around it, but also be supportive of the fact that they might still have a strong opinion. But I think there is kind of this need to help people become more adults in their way. Not that you tell them that that's what you're doing, but there's something very regressive about the polarization, because that's how kids are. Things are good and things are bad, things are right, things are wrong. And you hope there's going to be more of that kind of contextual way of looking at things. And you help people see that it can be both and, as opposed to either or. But I think it's very hard when people come out with it being very attacking. And sometimes I've noticed that one of the things that helps me have a conversation with someone, and I've worked with a lot of families now of people who are anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, anti-everything, and even on Zoom, they can't sit long enough to even have the conversation. They're so worked up. And so sometimes I will just start by talking about talking. How do we talk about this? How can we talk about it in a way where you feel heard and where I feel heard, where it doesn't take away anything from you, for you to listen, and for you to agree? And let's figure out how you can be taken seriously. And I will listen to your information, you listen to my information, but it's sort of the rules of engagement. And sometimes when people kind of lower their tone, lower the volume, they actually hear you a lot better. And one of the things that I say, and I even say to kids, if you're yelling, I won't hear your words. I will hear the volume of them. But if you want to be heard, then we need to talk in this kind of tone. And I've noticed that sometimes when people are not as worked up when they're talking, and they're talking in more of kind of a reasonable way, they hear their own words better. And I can see them thinking like, I don't know if what I just said makes sense. And it's an interesting thing to watch that happen. And so I just think developing a way of first talking about how to talk about it can be a way to lessen the tension and the divisiveness.
If I might follow on, because so much of what Rachel was saying resonated also with what I was thinking and some of my own experience. I'm thinking about diplomacy, and I think about, I was the only woman in Afghanistan for a number of years, and I worked out in the field. And I oftentimes was in a situation where I would be negotiating directly with Taliban or Taliban leading people. And to be, the only woman in a tent of 100 men, and I'm trying to negotiate building a girls' school. And so, as Rachel was saying, what I learned, and I think most pastors probably know this, but it's so important to, first of all, engage. It's so important to be empathetic. It's so important to respect, at least be respectful in your tone and your words that you use with those that you're negotiating with. And I would think that pastors who have congregants who refuse to wear a mask or who want to come back into in-person services, similarity in the fact that they want to engage, they want to be empathetic, they want to find common ground. For me, that's always a key to any conversation is, I know we share common goals. What are those? And how can we work toward those common goals? We may not agree on whether to wear a mask or not, but we do agree that we want to be safe, that we want to be healthy. We don't want to lose our members. We don't want to lose family members. And also I find sometimes it's helpful in a difficult conversation that it may not be the place at the pastor. Maybe it's somebody else that's a better proxy. Maybe it's a nurse or a doctor, or a healthcare worker that's a member of that congregation who can have that conversation with those members who are distant, don't believe the science. I do find also that usually you can't argue with someone, you can't argue with them based on facts. We're all drawn to stories, we're drawn to personal connection. We're not, you can't change someone's mind arguing with facts.
Mhm.
Heather, do you have anything you want to add to that from your perspective?
I do, because like many of you, I am walking through this with my own congregation right now. And we're 2 weeks away, of course, from Holy Week and Eastertide. So I would say just the following, and I want to recognize from the outset that a lot of you as clergy aren't making that decision yourselves, right? In congregational and connectional polities, your boards are making those calls. At the end of the day, you are just the moral authority as the clergy person. One thing that's challenging is that a lot of people espouse QAnon beliefs that they don't know they're QAnon beliefs, because QAnon is so diffuse. The information they get is from podcasts, Steve Bannon or InfoWars or any of that. They're going to listen to this and they don't say this is QAnon information. So if you have congregants who are listening to these sources, they may not know that what they're saying is QAnon related, right? So I have said to people, I'm just curious, are you aware that what you're saying is in line with the things that QAnon espouses? And they will be caught up short. And I'm not trying certainly to embarrass or shame anyone, but just make them aware, right? And just that very calm tone. Are you aware that that is something that QAnon espouses? And that very often takes the conversation in a different direction. But the tack I have taken is to be the example. I have never caught without a mask. We did outdoor worship in our parking lot from July to the end of October, masks, distancing, no singing, no chatting afterward. And we plan to take that up again for Eastertide with patio heaters outside, those ones that you have at restaurant patios. So if that's a practical possibility for your congregation, consider it. But just this thinking outside the box, how could we do this more safely, right? There is no such thing as safety, but what is more safe? What is safest? Because spiritual needs are real, and people's need to get back in church is real, right? And as spiritual leaders, it is our desire to make sure that our flock gets fed. And yet I have to balance that with the charge that I have to care for my flock, which is not just a spiritual charge, right? I can't take care of your spirit if your body is dead. I can't do that. So if you are Christian clergy, certainly you can remind your folks that our command is to care for the least of these. And the least of these at this point are those who are unable to be vaccinated yet, right? I have 5 children. My children cannot be vaccinated. In my state, I am not yet vaccine eligible as clergy, right? I'm in the next group. I could as a therapist, but if you're Jewish clergy, the concept of pikuach nefesh, right? The idea of caring for the soul, that we watch over a soul, and that is the important factor that supersedes any kind of religious law. My local rabbi, she and I are quite friendly, and their congregation have been selling masks that says, "Thou shalt not COVID thy neighbor," which I just thought was delightful. And then the last one I would say is an idea from ethics that I took in my graduate program, which is just the idea of projective retrospective thinking. Can we project ourselves into the future and look at what the consequences of our behavior might be, right? So as clinicians, we're taught, if you have an ethical quandary, think about all the potential outcomes from all of your choices. Project yourself into the future. If I see a client with whom I might have a dual relationship, what could happen, right? And the same is true for your folks. If we gather together inside and one of our flock contracts COVID and dies from this, how do we as a community respond to that? And what responsibility do we take for it? And how do we feel and behave in the world after it? So there are a lot of choices to be made. None of them are comfortable. Every single consistory meeting I've had in the last 11 months has been tense at times. And yet, I believe it is our call to stay as strong in our protection of the vulnerable as possible.
This is incredibly helpful. I'm learning so much. For those of you who may be just joining us, this is Pastoring in the Age of Conspiracies and Disinformation. Our panelists are Rachel Bernstein, Reverend Heather Honeycutt, and Dr. Deborah Alexander. It's being co-hosted by the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Clergy Emergency League. So pastors aren't always getting this direct one-on-one. Sometimes it's parishioners complaining about their fellow parishioners who are saying these these conspiracy theories or this disinformation. So how does a pastor navigate this? Do they kind of try to stay out of the fray and see, does it escalate or does it kind of calm down? Like, are some people thinking, well, we have a different person in the Oval Office who is not espousing these things, so maybe the temperature's going to come down? Or should they try to meet one-on-one with the person who seems to be the source of all of this? Or is it better to talk to your governing board and say, hey, this is coming up. How do we handle this as a church? What are some of the ways that pastors can think about this?
Well, even though I'm not one, so I'll start and then I'll give the heavy lifting to ones who are. Okay, so I just want to say that I think to answer your question about how it should be handled, I want to say yes. I think all of those are good ideas. I think that it's important for people to be talked to one-on-one, and specifically one-on-one, because people who are believers of conspiracy theories are very worried about having kind of an intervention done on them. So if they walk into a room with more than one person, they're going to hightail it out. So being able to sit down one-on-one and to ask certain questions. And I think in that kind of conversation, to be able to do as much listening, to really diffuse, to kind of let that person get their frustration and anger out with you where it's safer, is a really good thing to do, so they really feel heard. Because sometimes people's volumes increase because they don't feel believed and they don't feel heard. And for some people, this, conspiratorial thinking works for them because it makes them feel, well, for some it makes them feel superior, but others it makes them feel like at least now they are kind of eye to eye with people when they felt less than or disenfranchised or powerless. So I think being able to feel heard is very important. I think then it's also good to talk to an entire congregation about it, because there are going to be a lot of people who this is affecting, who are not necessarily going to want to come forward, are not going to be the ones who want to have that kind of conversation, but they're hoping and waiting for it to be addressed, I think, with everyone, so they can see that the congregation is aware, that the pastor is aware of what's happening. What I think is important is also to do a bit of kind of psychology and reverse psychology. And I know I've a lot of friends who are rabbis who have done the following, where they will say, we love that you don't want to just follow the flock. And we know that you are individual thinkers who want to do it your way. The reverse psychology part is they're not doing it their own way. They're doing it the way they're told to do it, which is the opposite of the way that everyone else is doing it. So they're not any more free in their thinking, in fact, less so, but they don't realize it. So if you say, we want you to be able to really be able to follow your own instincts and the evidence that you have taken in, and we'll support that. And at the same time, there is a sense that it could be that it might be safer, let's say to go back to the mask idea, it could be safer to wear a mask. And we know if you are good people who really care about not being taken advantage of and you care about your community, that we know that you will be kind of wise enough and good enough to not want to take that risk just in case. Even if you don't necessarily agree with the science. And to have people, again, go into that gray area where they can make a decision based on the, well, just in case. It's like putting a ramp in front of a church, even if you don't have anyone who's in a wheelchair, just in case someone shows up who needs it. And so doesn't mean that you necessarily wanted to spend the money in that way, but just in case. And I think that's a part of being a community.
Rachel, that's really helpful. And one of the things that you said about one-on-ones and how that can be so less threatening. And I also want to point to that there are some two questions that came up in the Q&A, which I know we're going to get to more of these questions, but because these two questions specifically talk about how pastors deal with the one-on-one with QAnon. So someone asked, if you're trying to meet somebody where they are and you're trying to assist them, and all they want you to do is watch QAnon videos, or you're trying to do a one-on-one, but there are some power differentials when it comes to gender and power and your place in the church. Heather, how would a pastor deal with some of that tension, or even lack of safety sometimes in when they're trying to navigate this?
That's an excellent question. Is something my church didn't have to really deal with before me, because in its 140-year history, I'm the first female clergy person they've ever had. And so when I came and I said, well, I need a window in my office door, and these were things the church had never before considered, that as female clergy, I need all the doors locked and nobody to have a key except my custodian, right, my sexton. So in terms of power differentials, I think we need to recognize multiples, right? The first one is, as a clergy person, I have some authority in my people's life, right? The degree to which that is true depends on how they were raised, and kind of the way that I would say with my older members, the respect is kind of implicit because of the way that they were raised. And for some of my younger members, they kind of think of me more as a friend. But regardless, there is a power differential, even on my end, right? I am the one with theological education. I am the one who has some pride of place in the community. But there are also the fact that I'm 5'2", right? And I'm younger than most of them. But I was fortunate that I started at my church about 8 months before the pandemic hit, so they got to know me. I really feel deeply for those clergy who have started with their churches during the pandemic and are dealing with these same questions. But with respect to the one-on-one conversations, I would say a few things in particular. First of all, recognize that a direct assault on facts is not going to be very helpful, right? So they can espouse whatever it is they'd like to espouse, and you can say that's simply not true, and you're not going to get anywhere. You're going to be at cross purposes. So that's number one. Number two, I would say expect to be rebuffed, right? Even if you calmly approach them, even if you say, help me understand this. Help me understand, because I believe you to be a person of goodwill, and I think you believe me to be a person of goodwill, and yet we have come to wildly different conclusions about what's going on. So help me understand this from your point of view. And I need you really to listen, right? Notice that tight feeling in your belly and breathe through it, because we all feel it when we know we're going into one of those situations, and we all armor up a little bit, but just breathe into that tightness in your belly. And expect that even if you have set the table that way, right? Even if you have laid out kindness, even if you are monitoring your tone, even if you're watching your belly and you're hoping that your mirror neurons are doing their good work, that your folks who genuinely and deeply believe this are not going to hear what you have to say and assimilate it immediately, right? Your goal in these one-on-one conversations is to plant a seed. Okay, because at least my hope My hope is to be a person that when these folks begin to doubt that I've maintained a relationship, that they can come to me, right? I don't need to have all the answers. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in as their spiritual leader is opening the door to doubt a little bit, right? Sort of this aphoretic space, opening that for them where they can begin to doubt. Because I know that in there, they're still pliable, right? The person that you knew before QAnon is still in there. And that is a deeply held belief of mine. And just remember that their certainty is reactive to their doubt. Okay, so the way that they're expressing their 100% in certainty about the truth of this is actually a reaction to the doubt they feel somewhere deep inside that they're trying to stifle and bury.
Wow.
What you hear from folks who have left high control groups is that I had to repress this when I was in the group. I had to squelch my critical thinking. I had to be a person who, through prayer, through chanting, through meditation, through the thought terminating cliche of a thought terminating cliche is a thought that you use to halt cognitive dissonance, right? So something like, well, it was God's plan, right? That, or it was Q's plan, right? These are thought terminating cliches. And these people have them. These people have doubts, but they have to use these other means to stay in relationship with the group. And because they believe the group is the arbiter of truth, that is a required action, right? Because if they believe this is truth, and then they believe they want to stay in the truth, then they have to push down anything that doesn't align with that truth. And so if you can stay in relationship with these people, if you can be a safe space to hold these things, then you have a chance at maintaining relationship once they start to have some doubts. And the very last thing I would say is, I think, Leah, you asked about whether I would involve my board or consistory. I would let my board or consistory know that these ideas were circulating within my congregation, but I wouldn't say specifically who is espousing them. First of all, your board knows more than you do anyway, right? If you're a pastor, your board knows stuff you don't ever find out, right? Just like your admin assistant. My admin assistant knows everything. I find out 3 days later. But protect the person to the degree that you can, okay? Because they will likely be deeply ashamed when they come out of this, and we want to preserve their dignity to the degree that we're able.
Deborah, as you're listening to this and you're hearing a lot about relationships, and in your work dealing with political psychology and how people who have been in these kinds of high control groups and the families that are trying to navigate this as well, what advice could you give to people who are seeing either their parishioners with family members who are in it or their own family members are in it? How have you seen family members navigate this in your work, in your experience?
It's a tough question, isn't it? Because I think all of us probably have family members that maybe hold very different political views than we do, maybe even very strongly held. And then we have families that certainly have QAnon or who might have other white power people that are part of that. And so I recognize that, it's easy for me to say that dialogue is the most important thing. The relationship is important. Stay in relationship. Keep those communication channels open. But I also understand it is very scary. I did have a family member that was part of KKK. And I remember how scary it is because I couldn't argue him out of being a member of KKK. What I learned is that, and I think this is probably true of conspiracy theories and probably true of many other far right and extremist groups, is that he had an affiliation. He felt as though he belonged. That provided something for him. And it's not unlike, when I have interviewed mob bosses or Taliban or gang members in the past, I've oftentimes heard the phrase that I belong. And so I think when we're dealing with people who are going down that path, again, recognizing that they're getting something from it. So when you ask the question about congregants, my first thought is, how many people in the congregation are espousing this, disinformation, or have gone down the trail of one of the conspiracy theories? Sometimes you don't need to do much about the conspiracy theory. And a person that believes a conspiracy theory may not become an extremist. They may not join a mob, going up the steps of the Capitol. They may simply believe, like JFK, there was a conspiracy, or that we never really landed on the moon, or that 9/11 was plotted by, you name. And so sometimes conspiracy theories in and of themselves, they're a message to you to ask, why is it so important to that person? What is missing? Why are they attached to that so deeply? But it also may not be a red alarm yet. It's not that they are going to do that next step and become a violent domestic terrorist, for instance. So that's some of the thoughts that came to mind when so many family members, sometimes in someone exiting these groups, again, whether it was Taliban or whether it was KKK, it was important that we stayed in relationship, as Heather said earlier, that eventually that friendship, that open communication, that clarity that as a family member, I did not support anything that you believed in, being very clear about that, but also continuing that relationship. I'm thinking of, it's interesting, a quick story. I was reading recently about a young woman who is a documentary filmmaker, and she was at Charlottesville making a film. And out of that experience, she ended up interviewing a number of the KKK and others that were a part of that. And later on, she stayed in communication with them. And eventually one of the members, they had a email relationship only. She would visit, she would let them know how the documentary, again, maintaining that connection and that acceptance, asking questions, trying to understand why they were a part of the group that they were. Eventually, she was interviewed on a number of NPR stations and started getting a lot of hate mail and hate on her Twitter. And she showed a couple of the KKK members at one point when she was able to meet them for coffee outside of Washington, D.C. And she showed them the kind of messages that she was getting. And one of the members was so distraught because he had come to see her as a friend. And to see that she was being threatened, and it made him stop back. So she didn't have to argue with him on facts, just that relationship. And once he realized, he became more familiar with a Syrian Muslim woman of color doing a film. And so they worked, that border, that barrier was broken through, and that helped him decide to leave the KKK.
Wow. If you're just joining us, we are talking with Rachel Bernstein, Reverend Heather Honeycutt, and Dr. Deborah Alexander. This is Pastoring in the Age of Conspiracies and Disinformation, co-hosted by the Wisconsin Council of Churches with the director, Reverend Kerri Parker, and myself, Reverend Dr. Leah Schade, the co-founder of the Clergy Emergency League. Before we get to our Q&A, I just want to remind you that we are going to be sharing with you a list of resources that our panelists have put together for you about churches dealing with radicalized members, how to understand these cults, how to talk to people who are in cults, when people are trying to get out, how you can help them distinguish between fake news and disinformation, how they can start to create resilience, and as they're emerging from this, how can we be helpful for them in that process? We've got lots and lots of questions. I don't know how we're going to get to them all, Kerri, but let's see what we can get through.
Fair enough. We touched on some of the questions organically through the conversation already. I think something that's bubbling up is discerning the difference between radicalization and serious mental health issues. Most of us in the parish are not trained mental health professionals. We know just enough to know when we know we need to refer, but this stuff feels really entangled. Can any of you address that for us?
Yeah, I think that there are times that it is hard for me, when I've heard so many stories, so many cult stories, and talking about Heaven's Gate. I mean, if people didn't know about the mothership behind the Hale-Bopp comet, if someone had just come into a therapist's office and was talking about the mothership, then they would probably be referred to a psychiatrist. So you want to understand it contextually, find out where this information originated. If it originated here, it's a different story than if they got it off the internet or if they got it because of the group that they're in. What's also true is that for some people, if it's not this, it'll be something else, because they happen to be sort of paranoid in their thinking and they feel like everyone's up to something. And so these are the people who are going to be preparing for, the end a lot. And again, get drawn into this kind of thinking. So it didn't originate again from this particular group or this article. So find out the source and find out about their history, and find out also from talking to other people who know them, if they also have disordered thinking about other things. And so it is hard, though, especially with radicalization. You want to also understand it contextually. For example, talking about story, there was a woman I was working with who got caught up in being radicalized online. And when people would grill her about why she cared about this cause, she would just parrot what she had learned, but you could kind of tell it wasn't really absorbed. She would just say what she was told. And then once we got into what the draw was for her, she said, actually, it's because they remembered my birthday. And I said, well, I'm sorry, what? And she said, I was raised in a very big family with parents, one who's drug addicted, the other one who was never home. My birthday was never remembered. One of the first questions these people online asked me was about myself and my birth date. And they sent me a card and they sent me balloons. And she said, I was in. And it was an amazing thing to find out really what the intention is and what the needs are that are getting met. And if they're real and if they're based in something real and if in someone's history, you can also define really if it is mental illness or if it's just taking care of emptiness, which is something that you want to be able to discern. And I think also for some people, this becomes their drug of choice. If they are addictive in their personalities, if they have a history of addiction, there is the same kind of dopamine rush that comes from a lot of this kind of thinking. And I think that's why people get so worked up and they get so angry if you try to take it away. So again, find out about those kinds of pieces of their history and you'll know really a little bit more about what you're dealing with.
Anyone else want to address that? I mean, we are seeing questions about people hearing about prophecies and special revelations and things along those lines. And so this really does seem to be an emerging concern in the church.
I can speak a little to the prophetic piece. Before I was a mainliner, I was an evangelical who was in circles that were slightly more charismatic. And so one of the things that we were always taught, right, was test the spirits. So if somebody is giving a word of prophecy that's not confirmed by anybody else, then that would have been something that gave us pause in a circle like that, right? So if somebody is saying, COVID is a hoax, which most of us have heard at some point in our professional, clinical, pastoral lives, who is confirming that, right? Is there a reputable person who is known as a prophet who is confirming that? And that's what you're not likely to see, right? Churches that base decisions on a word of prophecy that don't have confirmation and that don't have community support can be scary. And I would say, we're taught to discern the spirits, to read the biblical text, to understand how to be the religious people that we are in community. And so if you as an individual person are seeing something about God, the church, and the world in community that is rejected by your whole community, then the mature thing to do, right, is revise that and say, you know what, I'm going to put a pin in this and I'm going to spend some more time with it. One thing that's challenging, of course, is that we all want to believe that we hear from God and that God speaks to us, and that those various ways of hearing are good, right, and valid. And for some people, that's just not true. And people abuse the prophetic word in myriad ways. So I would say that is one thing. But, you can watch radicalization happen. There's like a set of things that you see. So if you have an established relationship with someone and their personality starts to change, they develop what's called a cult pseudo personality, right? And so this is not who they are. And if you watch this radicalization process, you will see that happen. If they have a dramatic shift in belief and value that's just kind of seems to come out of nowhere, again, you might be watching radicalization at work. If folks can't make decisions on their own anymore, if they seem to have lost their agency, this is another thing that kind of happens during radicalization and during cultic indoctrination. If they globally apply this ideology, right? If it seems like it's the answer to everything, this is a step in radicalization. If they start to use words in ways that don't make sense, like the denotation of a word is not the way they're using this, because cults have in-group language that they use. And so if the words people are using no longer make sense contextually, then you can ask, certainly, right, what does that mean? Because that's not the definition I know of that word. And then when they start to become more dichotomous in their reasoning, Rachel said earlier, children have black and white thinking. Children have right, wrong, good, evil, black and white thinking. And when we see adults whose prefrontal cortices are fully developed, when we see them kind of regress to that way of thinking, we can perhaps know that some of this radicalization process is going on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We've received a really important question here. We've had some earlier conversation on power dynamics, but the question of race hasn't come up yet. And when we're thinking about power dynamics, we have to account for that. Our panel appears to be all white. And we've been asked by an Asian American pastor about what thought we have about communities and congregations that are mixed racially or are predominantly not white, how race and power dynamics impact the conversation, and what adequacy or inadequacy we have for speaking into that.
So this is a challenging question, right? Because race is something that the church is just now starting to tackle. Traditionally, even in churches with multiple racial and ethnic groups, clergy, because of ordination and educational requirements, tend to be white, even in those kinds of churches. Add to that, even if you do have a clergy person who is of a different race or ethnicity than their congregation in the main, there is sometimes a lack of respect for that clergy person from within the community. So with respect to race, and I am not an expert, I have done my work to the degree that I have been able, and I continue to do my work around race, but I recognize my position as a well-educated middle-class white woman, right? And the privilege that carries. But you have to tread lightly, right? Because theology traffics in ultimacy, by which I'm talking about Tillich, right? Paul Tillich would say theology deals with ultimate things. But oftentimes we conflate the ultimacy of the holy with what we think is important. And Paul Tillich would call that idolatry, right? But particularly with nationalism and Christian nationalism, you get this idea that whatever is most important in our community is what is most important. And because that is what is most important to God. And so if you're pastoring a church, we need to recognize the cultural pieces at play. If you have, I would say, early in the pandemic, one thing we heard was, well, Asian countries have been masking in public when somebody doesn't feel well for decades, just out of courtesy, right, for other folks. So how do we defer to those whose countries seem to be well developed, well past where we are as Americans, right? You don't see Americans go out in masks when we feel poorly, for the most part. So how can we defer to the wisdom that these other cultures bring to us, right? We get to be recipients of that wisdom, which is, in my book, a grace. And so how can we be open to learning from that grace, that wisdom, and how that adds to what we do as Americans? It's not something we're most often open to, right? And that is a grave loss on our part.
Deborah, I'm wondering if you can speak to this, because you're appear to be a white woman, and you have been in non-white contexts in other countries. How have you navigated those dynamics around race, culture, ethnicity, nationality?
Well, I think those are the most interesting and most challenging questions. I'm not sure if I have navigated it necessarily in my official diplomatic capacities, although certainly each of us, I know in our own work, I would never sit down at a meeting where I would have a group of experts, for instance. I'm building schools in Afghanistan, for example, and I have builders, teachers, principals, donors at a table. I'm always going to make sure that there is a broad representation of interest there. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to look at our families, look at our neighborhoods, look at our churches and our synagogues and our mosques, to look at the groups that we're a part of, and to call out and acknowledge and see where we're blind, where we're part of all white groups, or where we are not fully appreciative of the diversity of friends and family that could be a part of that. And so, I mean, it's certainly a principle that I've brought into my work, and I'm sure everyone else as part of this discussion has also tried to be thoughtful about, when you look at your congregation, when you look at your social groups, how white are they? But with that said, I recognize the limits of my expertise. For instance, I'm not going to try to give too much advice to pastors because I'm not a pastor. But I also recognize how important the questions of race and how it determines our own experiences. I think my greatest sadness is that there is not a greater appreciation and integration of ethnic and religious in our own country. On one hand, we value diversity, and I think that many of us believe in that. But like, Dr. Martin Luther King said, the most segregated hour is Sunday morning. And so I'm still keenly aware of that problem and how each of us, take action. I also think about it in terms of radicalization, for instance, or extremism. We mentioned earlier that a number of extremist groups are white power groups, or, are based in hate. It might be hate of a faith group. It may be hate of an ethnic group or a color, or even Al Qaeda, hate of women. So you see this sort of how that bias, that prejudice, that disdain of difference, can go to the extreme and is used by extremist groups. And so I just feel as though it's incumbent on all of us and in our individual lives and our social lives to fight it, address it.
And I think also just to add to that, and I'll be brief, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Yeah, I was raised with Rabbi Schulweis, whose philosophy was predicate theology. There is this issue. What are we going to do about it? It's not enough just to talk about it and to think, oh, good, we had someone come in who's of a different race, ethnic, whatever, religion. Now we've done our part. We're not racist anymore. Not so fast.
That's right.
There is what are we going to do? How are we going to participate? What actions are we going to take? How are we going to struggle with this together and be with each other arm in arm, not just feeling kind of superior, like we touched on the subject. And the same thing with QAnon and conspiracy theories. I think a lot of them feel superior because they feel like they're really addressing this, but they're not doing a thing to help really with anything. They just think they are. And so I think helping people get into motion. And so what are you going to do? And how are you going to affect an actual change is a really important part of this.
I think that all of these questions are so critical and they intertwine with themes that have come up in this last hour and a half or so. We've heard about this idea of accompaniment, this sense of curiosity, right? Don't come at a situation assuming that you have the right answer and the solution is going to be for you to be declarative about it. That doesn't build relationship in community, and that's not what the church is about. We've been part of a coalition of groups in Wisconsin called Faithful Action for a Healthy Wisconsin. And it was ecumenical and it's been interfaith. And we started having conversations about pastors questioning, vaccination ethics. Should I get the vaccination as soon as I'm eligible, or should I wait because there are more vulnerable people who need it before me? And the pastors of color at the table were saying, whoa, that is not the question we are asking in our communities. And it stopped the white pastors and the pastors of predominantly white churches in our tracks. And it had us asking entirely different questions that needed to be asked. And I'm so grateful that our colleagues called us on our stuff. It needed to be done. And because they did, because they were generous enough to do that, we were able to use some of our privilege to speak into some of these places of power and start helping things shift. I think that Nicole, in her comment in the chat, talked about disparate access to the vaccine due to wobbly implementation, right? These questions about conspiracies and power and information flow, all of this is a result of breach of relationship, right? And how do we work at communication and relationship in a way that doesn't simply paper over real differences, but does the hard work of mending, of repair, because it's gonna be a long road. It has to be a long road. We are talking about hundreds of years of brokenness, whether it is race, whether it is economic brokenness and how all of these things are intertwined, and radicalization. It's colonization, all the ick, as I say to my daughter, that's all the ick. but this spirit of questioning and curiosity and humility has to infuse our relationships if we're going to make any progress.
That's really helpful. And thank you to our colleagues who pointed out the obvious. And we are continuing to work on representation all the time. For example, the Clergy Emergency League is going to be putting together a panel on eco-racism and the intersection between race and ecological issues. So that is something that is on our horizon. Kerri, what are things that the Wisconsin Council of Churches are doing to address that issue, or race and ethnicity and that sort of thing?
We are sponsoring a womanist preaching series in Wisconsin. 7 outstanding womanist preachers are offering sermons, and we're offering resources to people that they've recommended. And that will be launching after Easter. People can register for that now. I'm really excited to hear the themes that they're bringing to the table. So we're going to be able to get preachers in pulpits around the state in a much more realistic way than would have been possible in pre-COVID times.
That's great. We have about 2 minutes left, and this has been such a rich and helpful conversation. I want to just allow each of our panelists like 30 seconds. What is your best advice for pastors in going forward? What encouragement would you like to leave them with as we close out this evening? Rachel, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I think, first of all, just the fact that people are participating in this, it gives me hope and faith about things being different. And I can also see the size of the issue. And so I send you all support during this time. And of course, I'm available as a resource to whatever degree I can be. But I think, it's very important as we move forward to help people define things and redefine things. And when people doubt, they get scared. And, conspiratorial thinking makes people feel that if they doubt, they're weak. But really, doubt is a strength. In fact, I think there's a Persian proverb that says doubt is the key to knowledge. So for people to embrace their doubt and to help them through that, through the anxiety that it creates, but that it's a place of really learning, of being able to assess information, and also the idea of belonging. When people want to belong to something, you want to make sure they know that for many things, it's conditional. It's not unconditional. And so really belonging means really being a part of something unconditionally. And if you ask them, I think it's great that you feel you belong to this group, what happens to people who leave it? Are you able to still talk to them? Not. Do you have to look down on them? Not. Help them see that they should only give a sense of devotion and that they belong to something that really accepts them for who they are in their totality.
Wow. Deborah, how about you? How can you give us some final thoughts here?
Conspiracy theories, for instance, are people's way of coping. And so understand that there is a reason why people are drawn to conspiracy theories, but it doesn't mean that they'll necessarily become a radical, and that intervention is possible and hopeful. And we've talked about the ways of engaging and talking. They're so very important to keep that person talking with you. I don't want us to leave thinking that the internet's to blame. Oftentimes we like to imagine that it's all the internet's fault. Internet has just made conspiracy theories more broadly shared. It's made it more easy for people to find social groups that confirm their biases. There's a brain issue here that we find news and we find information to confirm those biases. But internet can also, there's enormous resources for people who are believers of conspiracy theory, but there's also lots of resources for those of us who are trying to bring people back to the middle, possibly to depolarize, to mend those breaks. I'm very impressed with the resources now that are available to many people trying to leave some of these more radical, extreme groups. So I encourage people to look for those resources and the resource list that you'll be sharing. And also, prevention is always easier than treatment, right? So let us always remember that to raise our children and to be pastors and to be friends and family members that encourage healthy skepticism, good critical thinking. How do we use the internet? How do we make decisions about what news is good news? And it's interesting to me that a lot of the research shows that reflection, stress management, a social life where you have many different kinds of people part of that social life, those are ways of inoculate against
Great
the
image.
worst.
Great metaphor. Thank you. And last thoughts, Heather?
Yeah, there's something I always like to share at the end of something like this. And it's a quote from Diane Benscoter, who wrote a book called Shoes of a Servant. And she writes, "I know why she detonated," speaking of a suicide bomber. "I know why a mother injected poison into her baby's mouth," speaking of Jonestown. "These were not acts of hatred, but of love, of deep belief." The people in your congregations who are caught up in these groups are not trying to be terrible. They think they're trying to be good. And they think they are being loving. And they think they are doing the right thing. So as long as we can approach them in the spirit of love to which we are called, as long as we can receive them and see them as beloved of the holy, then we are engaging our call to the church.
That is beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. It has been our pleasure, the Clergy Emergency League and the Wisconsin Council of Churches, to host this very important conversation on pastoring in the age of conspiracies and disinformation with our panelists, Rachel Bernstein, Reverend Heather Honeycutt, and Dr. Deborah Alexander. We have resources, 4.5 pages of resources that we will be putting on our respective websites and sharing with all of you who have registered. And Reverend Parker, can you give us a final closing and a prayer?
I would be happy to. Again, all of this is coming out by email. You'll get a recording link by email. So if you could not take down notes fast enough, if you want a chance to absorb this information more fully, it's on its way. Lots is overwhelming right now. It's okay. You don't have to take it all in at once. Let's be in a spirit of prayer together. Holy One, you who know are too much and are not enough, and you who are enough for us. We give thanks for wisdom. We give thanks for companionship. We are ever so grateful to know that in this world, in times of difficulty, we are not alone. You do not abandon us nor forsake us. You send messengers and helpers, companions along the way, that when there are times of crisis, your people will gather, and there will be light that shines, that when things are dim, there will be warmth that wraps around us, holding us close. We trust that there is a path forward, and that in your wisdom, you will lead us to it, and that together as your people, we will find it. We give thanks for all good gifts. Bless our rest and your work to your purposes. Amen.
Amen.
My friends, we will put up a slide as we go if you want to jot down any contact information. Otherwise, have a good night. Take good care.
Thank you.